The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, president at 1615, and I also serve as a church missions coach. I want to take this moment to share with you about some upcoming events and resources available. We have some webinars right around the corner that you may be interested in. The first is called Reaching the Nations, Right Here, Right Now. It's with Joan Lash of International Students Incorporated. And really, we live in an unprecedented time where the mission field in many ways has come to us with immigration, refugees, international students. And so if you're interested in learning how God can mobilize you and your church to engage cross-culturally right here in the United States, you'll definitely want to join this webinar and join in what God is doing to reach the nations. The next, Wednesday, May 17th, 2017 at 12 noon, by the way, all of our webinars are at 12 noon Mountain, is Mind the Gaps. It will be led by David Wilson of Avant Ministries, also co-author of Mind the Gaps, and he's written a book about engaging the church in missionary care, and the content from this webinar is going to come out of that book. It's exceptional. How does a local church marshal its people and resources to care for those servants who are sent to the ends of the earth to serve as missionaries? And it's often a challenging subject. How do you care for one of your sons and daughters of your fellowship or your congregation that's serving thousands of miles away? He provides not only spiritual insights as to the importance of missionary care, but a lot of practical instruction on how you can connect your people at home to those missionary servants serving abroad. We hope you'll join us for Mind the Gaps, engaging the church in missionary care. And then, of course, the Mission Table. We are now in our third season, or getting ready to film our third season, I should say. And the Mission Table was born out of an idea that the church should think deeply about missions. And we want that thinking to lead to action. And so we gather together leading missions thinkers and practitioners, and we tackle some of the most critical and controversial topics impacting the missions world today. You can watch archive episodes and find out about upcoming episodes as well. And so visit missiontable.org to find out more information about the Mission Table. And hopefully you'll join these moving conversations that will hopefully move you to action. So today's webinar is entitled Stewardship. What is our role and responsibility? There are 5 different classes of assets for which we have responsibility: time, talents, truth, treasures, and relationships. As Christians, we have a responsibility for investing each of these assets in line with the Master's guidelines and for his purposes. We are stewards 24 hours each day. We have been vested with God-given talents and gifts. We are trustees of God's truth, and we all have specific physical, material, and financial holdings, and we each have a network of relationships. Investing each of these assets in line with the Master's purposes results in what we call giving. But how do we invest all of God's assets wisely? Today's subject matter experts are Virgil Dugan and John Moore, and I'm happy to say they are dear friends of mine. We've been doing ministry together for several years now, and it's just such a joy. Virgil is the president of the Harris Foundation, whose mission is to elevate, encourage, and enable the ministry of biblically based organizations. John Moore is the founder and principal at John Moore & Associates, an independent assets management and consulting practice. He's also very involved in the Kingdom Advisor Ministry. In just a moment, I will hand the microphone over to Virgil and John, but first, a couple of details for our live audience. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. I want you to know, as questions come to mind today during the presentation, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. For the last 15 or 20 minutes of the webinar, we'll be addressing your questions. This is your opportunity to join the experts in the conversation. 42 people from around the U.S. are registered for today's live webinar. We're so glad that you joined us. A reminder, this webinar is also being recorded and will be available for download at 1615.org in the next few weeks. Once again, that's 1615.org. in the next few weeks. Virgil and John, thank you so much for taking time today to share with us your wisdom and experience. And it's going to take me just a moment to hand the controls over to Virgil and John. Gentlemen, the webinar belongs to you.
Okay, I think we have control here. This is Virgil Dugan, and I might just say that John and I will be going back and forth on the slides and the discussion this morning. We are very appreciative of this opportunity to speak with each of you, and we do hope that the concepts and principles that we will discuss today will be not only helpful for you, but helpful to those whom you disciple and minister to. Matthew mentioned the word stewardship, and that's the key word in everything that we're going to be talking about today. And I might just preface our remarks by saying that stewardship is a concept that's not well embedded in our culture or in our thinking. There's this tendency that we have in our Western culture to think about personal ownership. That is, what do I own and what might I give from what I own? And so oftentimes even the use of the term give brings to our minds a concept of personal ownership rather than God's ownership. So we're going to try to address that this morning and then hopefully give some practical suggestions about how to go about this whole concept of stewardship. And we'll be talking about investing rather than giving and managing that which is entrusted to us rather than that which we own. So just to get us started this morning, it's always good to realize that God owns everything. Now, I love Colossians 1:16 and 17, where it says, "For by him all was created, both in heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all has been created through him and for him." And I emphasize the little word all because it's that simple little Greek word pos that includes everything, not just the physical or financial things, but it includes everything. So as we think about stewardship today, we need to really realize the completeness of God's ownership and then how he has entrusted assets to us for oversight and management. So it's interesting to go back and think about how we fit into this created order that God has established. And actually it goes back to the beginning in Genesis chapter 2, where it says that the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and to keep it. And if you really dig down into those two words, cultivate and keep, you see that cultivate really implies a responsibility for oversight and for working things. Very practical term. And then the word keeping has the context of protecting a created investment. So this whole concept of stewardship goes right back to the very beginning. God created it all. Man was given the responsibility to oversee it for God's purposes in line with his will. And that has continued to the very day in which we live today. That's the way it is. John, I know you have a thought about this, how we should think and act.
You know, we in our business often deal with people who don't come from a biblical worldview. And we've been trying, God owns their stuff too, by the way. So what we've been trying to do is come up with a way to communicate this idea of stewardship to someone who doesn't have a biblical background. And we came up with the thought that if we act like managers rather than owners, we end up making better decisions. And we observe our clients as they start thinking about managing what they've been given, make better decisions once they don't hold it quite so tightly and quit acting like an owner.
And you know, if you want to take another look at this, the parable of the stewards in Matthew 25 is another great illustration that was given to us by Jesus. And I think it's instructive to sort of read between the lines. We all know this story of how the master was going away on a long trip, and he called his slaves or servants to come, and he gave one 5 talents, one 2, and one 1. And he expected them to oversee the use of these investments. If you look at it very carefully, you notice in chapter 25, verse 16, that the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with the talents. Now that word trading comes from the root word, which means he put them to work. He invested them. So I might imagine that he bought another section of land in which to expand the vineyard that he was operating, or maybe he added to the sheep herd that he was managing, or something like that. And likewise, the person with the 2 talents. And of course, they would have utilized part of the proceeds from that operation to care for their family and pay expenses. But the point is, they invested the talents that had been given by the master for the master's benefit. And when the master returned home, he called them to account. He asked them how they had managed those things that had been entrusted to them. And of course, they were rewarded, or in the case of the servant who did not wisely use the 1 talent, he was chastised. So this concept goes all the way back to the beginning and is strongly emphasized and illustrated, I think, by Jesus' example here in Matthew 25.
And when Matthew Ellison talked about the dimensions of stewardship that include time, talent, treasures, truth, and relationship, what came to mind is this idea that time and talent really go together. You can't use your talents without giving of your time. And one of the things that I've seen demonstrated as good stewardship, one of my good friends is an airline pilot, but he's also very good with woodworking. And so he made a decision to upgrade the pulpit at our little church, and he also made new hymnal racks for the choir and for the rest of the folks in attendance. And they were all handmade, lovingly made by this individual. And I always pictured that someday I might get on John's airplane and see wood panel, instrument panel, just because of how good he is with woodworking. But the thing is, they really do go together, time and talent. And it gives someone an opportunity to exercise something that maybe they don't do during their normal work, but it ends up being good stewardship. This idea of where to make our investments, I always think it's a good idea to be carefully listening to who God would have us pray for. And a lot of times those ministries that God has you praying about may be deserving of financial support. And the other thing that I've noticed is if something's particularly bugging me, I'm not happy about something, maybe that's a ministry I ought to be praying for, and that, again, might lead to engagement of time and talent with that particular ministry. My wife and I have made a decision with the where, and we like to call it going deeper with fewer. And so we've come to the idea that we're going to take on 5 major projects and give more money than we've ever given in a single gift to these 5 things. And I get 1, Connie, my wife gets 1, and we get 3. And just the conversation over what those 5 things could be has really taken our generosity, our giving conversation to a completely new level. Even though we've been married for 39 years, I learned things about her that I never knew by listening to her heart and what she had to say about the causes that she really cared about. And the how, it really comes down, talk about giving generously and cheerfully, and that verse, God loves a cheerful giver, the Greek word there is hilaros, from which we get hilarious. And whenever the offering plate is passed, I don't think I've ever seen anyone laughing. Even sometimes I can't even get a smile on their face. And finally, this idea of giving wisely. And the best way I know to give wisely is to plan your giving. And what we have learned is that people with a plan give about 30% more than people with no plan. We're going to give you some specifics on some of that plan a little bit later, but there's a group called Kingdom Advisors that Matthew mentioned, and they have a certification called Certified Kingdom Advisor, and basically these are financial planning professionals who have been taught a biblical worldview on finance and specifically how to help people plan their giving. So you might seek out a CKA in your area as a resource for helping you have conversations about giving, about planning your giving. We spend a lot of time talking about Proverbs. There's a lot of financial passages in Proverbs, but in particular this verse from Proverbs 3:9, honor the Lord with your wealth. That means your stuff, your riches, and from the first of all your produce, meaning your income. And what that really led Virgil and I in a conversation that the biblical model is to give out of assets in addition to giving out of income. And the church has spent so much time focused on tithing, which is really income-based giving, and I think we've really missed the opportunity to consider giving out of assets.
It gets right down to it. I think this verse in 1 Timothy 6 is a great encouragement where it says, instruct them to do good. Paul's admonition to Timothy, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. That's what we all really aspire to, is taking hold of that which Christ would indicate or label or characterize as life indeed. I'm always captured by the word good here, because I think we, in our modern vernacular, do not properly appreciate that word. I know when I think of good, I think about good, better, best, or ABC, where a B is good and a C is average. But this word good is the Greek word kalos, which doesn't really mean good like we speak of good. It means something that is beautiful, that is awe-inspiring, that is something noble or of honorable character or worthy of praise. And when we speak of this, we're talking about something that's beautifully lovely or winsome or praiseworthy and excellent in its nature and characteristics. So as we get into this concept of investing for the master's benefit and in line with his will, we are engaging in something that is awe-inspiring and that is honoring to the master himself. I think this is the way we need to begin to think. And as we do that, we would be encouraged, of course, to perhaps operate and think and pray and rejoice in a way that we have not done before.
You know, the way I like to think of this is that we are each given a piece of God's portfolio to manage. And any good portfolio manager always has an investment policy statement. That basically sets the framework for how they manage a portfolio. And we think that this idea of giving 10+1 is a great way to start with a giving policy. And as you think about, many people are at what we call an accumulation phase of life. They're still actively engaged in a career. They have income coming in from salary or from business. And so the idea here of 10+1 is if you're not sure how much to give, consider giving 10% of total income to fund operations at your church, plus consider giving 1% of invested assets each year to fund maybe a development or growth of a great commission ministry, something that's got some long-term benefit. And this idea of 10+1 still leaves plenty to make lifestyle choices, and it still leaves plenty with a good investment portfolio for the investment portfolio to grow for future planning purposes. So one other thing to think about, we like to call this the P's and Q's of giving, and maybe some people say, well, I just can't really start with 10. I'm just not in a position to do that. But what we think is important, and thanks to Andy Stanley's book, Fields of Gold, the thing is, you've got to make it a priority. The Bible talks about first fruits giving, and one concept that we like to tell people is this should be the first check that you write, and if you don't write checks, it's the first bill that you pay is essentially the giving percentage that you commit to. And if you can't start with 10, maybe you start with 2 or 3 with the idea that the default should be 10, but maybe you work your way toward that from income, and then consider what percentage of assets you might want to give. And over time, make that a progressive process increasing the percentages both in the assets and the income side. And then we'd like to talk about the idea that God does prompt us, and sometimes it may be an impromptu prompt. The idea that if you feel God leading you to support something, seize that opportunity, and maybe part of your planning process is to have a sleeve in your giving budget that is designed for the impromptu giving. That way you still got it planned, but it's sitting there available when God gives you a prompting that you can then respond to quickly. And then once you've given, the idea that you get things done and taken care of, and that you continue to assess where your money's going to be sure that it's being employed properly by the particular ministry or church. There's a different phase of life that many of us are entering into right now, and that's what we call the distribution phase. Maybe you're not actively employed, or maybe you're doing more volunteer work. And the idea here is 10 plus 1 still works in a distribution phase. You just consider giving 10% of whatever your planned lifestyle is to fund operations at the church. Plus, at that point, you start to look at what surplus assets might be available over and above the basic funding that you could maybe increase the percentage of your assets so that you are able to do more giving while you're alive. And my friend Ron Blue likes to say, do your giving while you're living so you're knowing where it's going. And I think that the opportunity to do this out of assets in this distribution phase can be very significant. And then let's not forget that we don't know the day we're going to die, that we're going to graduate. And because of that, we do need to do some planning. And one of the things that we like to talk about is the next generation really ready to become stewards? And the concept we like to use is love them equally, treat them uniquely. And let's say that one of my friends had a $5 million estate, but they had one child who had a very significant drug problem. And rather than give that child $1 million in cash if they were to transpire, that particular family made some decisions about how to handle that particular inheritance to that particular child. The idea here is that you need to do as much planning about this as when you're living so that you don't have a negative impact on your future generations.
You know, in that context, I like to bring us back to this word stewardship because if you're like me, you didn't really appreciate what that word means. That word, word stewardship comes from an old English word where the word ship is not the boat that floats on the water that we think of, but it was the early form of the word shape or form. So when we think about being or enabling stewardship, we're actually shaping the form of a steward. Something that we all have a responsibility for, not only in our own right, but also in the light of someone we may be discipling or ministering to. Now, there's a question that we all deal with at some point. And sometimes we deal with this question out of fear, which is the wrong thing. And it really gets down to where's our heart. Because God's told us in His Word that we must do as we have purposed in our hearts, not grudgingly or under compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver, as we mentioned a moment ago. So again, the question that comes up is, where is our heart? Is our heart being controlled by or in some way compromised by fear of there not being enough? I have a friend right now who's in his late 70s. He has a lot of millions of dollars in the bank, and he lives only on his Social Security because he has this fear of one day not having enough, and he has no concept of how he can really invest those assets for God's work in line with God's plan. So fear is the thing driving his life, and there's no cheer, there's no joy in that life as a result of that. So it's something we have to guard against. And it's something practically we need to deal with, because if we're going to give out of assets, we need to know how much is enough in terms of living reasonably under God's protective guidance, and then from there we can make a good decision about how to invest the remainder. Did you want to add to that, John?
You know, one of the things that one of my clients said to me after the market collapsed in 2008 and 9 was he never regretted the money he gave away. He may have regretted some portfolio decisions, but he never regretted any of the giving decisions, even though he had lost a significant amount of money during that period of time. So we have a theme in our office that we are trying to take nationally, globally, and that is never write another check. The idea behind this is one of the benefits of asset-based giving is that you can avoid capital gains taxes by giving away appreciated assets. Now the gift must go to a tax-exempt charity, and the holding period must have been for longer than 1 year. But when you do that, you avoid paying income tax on the capital gain. The charity gets the full value of the donation, and in the way I see it, there's only one loser in that transaction, and that's the IRS. And by avoiding sending money on a one-way trip to Washington, you end up sending it to impact the kingdom. So there's opportunity to do this when you're rebalancing or restructuring a portfolio. And we have a list of givers in our client base, and before we make a sell decision on a particular stock, if it's been held long enough and it has appreciated enough, we will call them and see if they'd like to give it away rather than have it generate the capital gains. The other thing is, as people get older, there's a required minimum distribution, and so I put that little acronym thing for the benefit of those who like acronyms. I'm an ex-military guy. So RMD, QCD, AKA, CR, in plain English means required minimum distribution is something that starts when you're 70 and a half. At that point, you can actually consider giving what's called a qualified charitable distribution direct from your IRA to a charity, and that is sometimes called a charitable rollover. The major benefit of this is that particular gift does not show on your income tax, and you don't get the tax deduction, but you don't get the taxable income, and that can be important when it comes to calculating Medicare premiums and the taxability of Social Security. And as our population ages, the whole idea of thinking about the RMD, the required minimum distribution, as a charitable giving tool is something that Congress recently made permanent and should be included in any financial plan. The whole idea behind all this is you're really trying to save taxes wherever possible while continuing to support ministry and kingdom outreach.
So in the context of giving out of assets, as John is discussing, there are a lot of opportunities. So we need to take an inventory of assets that have been entrusted to us so that we know what we can then invest for kingdom enterprise. And as John mentioned, marketable securities such as stocks, bonds, mutual funds, etc., can be given away. And again, as John emphasized, that must be done before the sale so as not to incur the capital gains tax. Something that we would call complex assets, business interests, closely held businesses in particular, can be given away. Now, in this context, it can be partial shares in ownership. If it's a sub-S corporation, then, or a LLC that an individual owns, he may want to give away some number of the shares of that corporation. This can be done at time of considering sale, before the sale, or it might even be done without a sales interest in terms of just giving it away to something like a community foundation who holds partial interest in that business. Therefore, the prior owner does not incur tax, ordinary income tax, on those shares that are held by a community foundation and have been given away. You can give away real estate. You can give away life insurance policies or name someone as the beneficiary of that policy. That is a charitable organization. And finally, you can give away tangible assets like art, jewelry, etc. There are special rules there, so you have to talk to a tax advisor to be sure you understand those special rules in the context of art and jewelry.
And you know, one other thing about assets they may be depreciated assets, like stuff at your home, and the idea that you might have if they're depreciated, you want to sell them first and give the cash.
That's
You're
right.
still giving out of assets.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be, something complicated. And we know a young woman who had a garage sale that with some matching gifts ended up turning a couple of $1,000s into about, was it $20,000? $30,000 altogether.
$30,000.
Just from a simple garage sale in her neighborhood.
So there's a promise that goes with the guideline that's provided in 3:9, which again, honor the Lord from your wealth and the first of all your produce, and that is, if we follow that principle, if we follow that wisdom and that guidance, it says our barns will be filled with plenty and our vats will overflow with new wine. I like to really just sort of concentrate on what those barns are filled with or what those vats are overflowing with. And I think one good interpretation of that is that this process of joyful, cheerful, generous, wise giving can result in barns being full of peace and vats overflowing with joy. The barns of our life would be characterized by peace, and the vats of our life would be characterized by joy. Just a great encouragement of how we should think as we consider functioning as a steward, not as an owner, recognizing God owns it all, that our purpose in life is to invest it in line with His will for His purposes, for His glory, and out of that comes the fruit of the Spirit, peace and joy. Now that's where we had planned to kind of wrap up today, Matthew, and I think you might want to take it over from there and see if there are any questions that we might need to handle.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights on this incredibly important topic here. Let me get back to my screen, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer here. So a reminder to our live audience, if you have questions for John and Virgil, please type them in the question and answer panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Virgil or John, or both of you, I've got a great question here from Paul Brown. He says, with less than 1% of Christian giving going to the 1/3 of the world that has no access to the gospel, how would you encourage people to move beyond the 10+1 giving plan? Would you consider maybe a 5 or 6% plan instead, or something similar? So kind of two pieces there. There's a incredible disparity, as we've talked about many times, Virgil and John, when it comes to resources being directed to the neediest of the needy. That he surfaces that, and then he's suggesting maybe a little more aggressive giving plan. So I'll let you answer that one.
Well, I think we started off with the idea, and if it wasn't clear, I'd like to make it clear that 10's just kind of the starting point. And we've watched givers start with 10, and that whole idea that Andy Stanley talks about being progressive, increasing their percentages. We now have one family giving over 35% of their income, and that the 10 goes to their church, and the balance they've been using for evangelism and for support outside the United States. And it might well be that again, how much you give is between you and God, and where it goes is between you and God. But as guidelines, that's something to think about. I also, one of the women we used to work with, she's now in heaven. When the first time I met with her, I was asking her about her giving, and she says, well, I give 55% of my income. And I said, really? Why 55? And she said, well, I can only write off 50%. So if I don't give some that I can't write off, then that kind of helps me know my heart's in the right place. She said, and the best part is it drives my accountant crazy because you can only deduct 50%. So Virgil, you went ahead.
Yeah, and back to this 1% of assets, quite honestly, what we see, and we see this all too often, is that people do not think about giving out of assets. But 90% of the total financial ability that we have is wrapped up in assets rather than income. And as an example of that, if you look at the wealth in the U.S., financial wealth in the U.S., and look at people who have invested assets between about $40,000 and $1 million, That is something today approaching $50 trillion in total assets. So I often use the illustration, if 10% of those people are evangelical Christian, and if 10% of that 10% are giving charitably, and they're giving 1% per year, that is something of order $5 billion per year that can go into, Great Commission ministry, like reaching the lost. And people don't realize the power of that. And the fact that if all of a sudden there was an extra $5 billion per year on the table, all of our missions organizations would have to wonder how to spend it. It'd be a great problem to have. So there's tremendous potential there. I might also add, and I say this to encourage all of you who are listening in the missions world, most people in the church do not recognize the fact that we have the population of unengaged, unreached people groups around the world that we have. And they have not identified with the Great Commission in the context of making disciples of all the people groups. It's just something not in our consciousness, so we need to keep emphasizing that.
That reminds me
I
of
think
something,
that
Virgil.
going deeper.
Go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
Yeah. That whole idea of going deeper with fewer, and Connie and I ended up with one particular evangelical outreach that does audio Bibles, and that has become kind of our lead project because we know it's an efficient and effective way to get the gospel out around the world. But we didn't get to that conclusion without spending the time to think about it and pray about it and get to know that ministry.
Yeah. Paul responds to that, by the way. He wants to say, yes, that's part of my job, smiley face, educating the church about UUPGs and UPGs. And I was going to mention something you said, Virgil, about the church not knowing about the unreached peoples of the world, not understanding the cross-cultural global dimensions of the Great Commission. Ralph Winter's the founder of the Perspectives on the World Christian Movement, who's now worshiping in heaven. But he said, how can you blame people for being involved in so many trivial matters when they have no access to truly explosive information about the Great Commission? And the idea is, maybe they're not giving, not because they're stingy or they don't want to give, they just don't know. And so very, very encouraging to educate the church on those topics there. This is from Frank Yang. He says, what are some best practices in helping people consider putting missions organizations into their estate planning or wills?
Well, one of the things that we coach our clients to and that we practice as a family is we have a designated percentage of our estate going to ministry, and we've instructed our successor trustee to actually look at where our current giving is, and that whatever God was calling us to give at the time he calls us home, they will end up with a share of a piece of that particular slice of the charitable plan in our estate plan. And essentially you let whatever the current giving drive the estate giving by having that kind of open-ended opportunity. One of the concerns we have is sometimes organizations drift from their mission, and we don't want to have to go change our estate planning documents every time that might happen.
Yeah, and it's so beneficial, again, to have family meetings in which you really talk with kids about your estate plan and involve them in giving if you can before the fact so that they appreciate what your heart is. So again, stewardship, forming stewards, is something you do way before death. It's something you need to do right now. And that then propagates into a continuation of that giving discipline and perspective, and again fosters good stewardship down the line. So family stewardship, family giving, family investing meetings for kingdom work, is something I would highly advocate.
Even when our girls were young, we used an envelope system with them, and they would have, with their allowance, they would have their lifestyle envelope, they would have their saving envelope, and they would have their church envelope. And we taught them from the beginning that you would live on 80% of your allowance, you would save 10, and you would give away 10 as a way to get them started with the stewardship in very practical terms. And I think you could still do that today, even with fancy computers and everything. Envelopes still work. In fact, we joked around Y2K, we were going to switch to Ziploc bags so we could see what money was in the Ziploc bag and be Y2K compliant.
That's
And
right.
another idea there that I see and appreciate, I know my wife Sandy and I do this, and I know a number of other families that do this, which is to set up donor-advised funds for their children in a location like the National Christian Foundation, and actually fund that donor-advised fund for their kids, and that then becomes an incentive not only to practice giving to Great Commission work, but also to learn how to do it wisely and appreciate the value of making of gifting appreciated property.
You know, let me key off of that, Virgil. There's one question from a pastor here. He says, how would a church or how might a church utilize an asset-based missions giving strategy? Could you explain that?
Let's see, not quite sure where that comes from, but I would go back to a very basic point that we need to educate our people about the wisdom and the power of giving out of appreciated assets. There's very seldom a week passes that I don't talk to a businessman who has significant assets under his stewardship, you know, like a prosperous business, and who has sold part or all of the business and has never even thought about giving away some of that business before the sale. And then afterwards they are surprised and disappointed that they have not been aware of that. So it's an awareness thing, as well as something that we need to discipline ourselves to do. So like John says, you know, you start somewhere. Maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 0.1%, but start the discipline of giving out of assets in addition to income and just watch what happens. It tends to fill the coffers of the church and of other parachurch organizations.
And I would add, maybe the way to do this is actually start a campaign on asset-based giving, targeting the missions outreach with assets. And maybe it's a sermon series, it's taking Proverbs 3:9, expanding on it. Maybe having a tax advisor, a tax expert talk about the tax benefits as part of the education effort, but actually make it a campaign, if you will, to get started. And again, what we've seen with our clients is it's like potato chips. You just end up, we had one client completely change his portfolio so he'd have more opportunity for appreciated assets to give away. Just an interesting thing that happens.
And I know in our church we have a fund, as John mentions, that is our missions fund. And at the Christmas time every year, we have a campaign in which we challenge people and encourage people to give out of assets to that fund. Not out of their income, but out of assets. And of course doing that in addition to whatever their gifting might be to church operating budget.
And I would add, we've had such a good run in the stock market really for the last few years. People may be sitting on appreciated assets, and the timeliness of really talking about asset-based giving, it could be very significantly good time to be doing that right now, just based on the stock market.
And again, back to that critical question, how much is enough? Everybody needs to be challenged to think about that, because again, we often see, and I've heard John say this many times, that there are people with assets that are significantly in surplus of what they need to fund their basic lifestyle, but they don't know that, they haven't figured that out, and they haven't been challenged to consider that. So just the gentle challenge, or maybe having illustrations or testimonies, can go a long way toward really opening that door.
And it takes a planner to help them do this planning who has to be willing to give out of assets also, because most planners are paid on assets, and it's counterintuitive to be teaching people about this. But it is God's economy. We remind advisors that we talk with all the time. It's God's economy. It's really God's portfolio that you have responsibility over. And once the advisor gets unleashed, then they become evangelical about it almost with their clients, and that the leverage from the advisor side is significant.
John, you mentioned maybe a teaching series on the proverb that was mentioned, or any number of things, and that reminds me of something that we talk a lot about in the missions coaching process when we work with churches, and that is knowing comes before doing and shapes doing. And so a big part of this is the biblical basis for generosity, the why of generosity, the joy of generosity, or as Virgil mentioned, the compelling vision of the unreached. That's really where it starts, and then putting into place some of the practical pieces, the practical education. Let me ask this. Virgil, could a church start one of those funds? I don't know the nature of the question that was asked, but let's say there's a compelling vision to reach the world in place. There is some education on the biblical basis of generosity and asset-based giving. God owns it all. But then how would a church, you mentioned a missions fund, but how would a church receive complex financial gifts? Is that possible?
It sure is. It can be done two ways, depending upon the size and sophistication of the church. The church can set up a brokerage account, so to speak, and then receive gifts into that brokerage account directly, or the church can open what would be called a designated fund, single charity fund at National Christian Foundation or some other community foundation, and use that fund as the receiving fund for complex gifts of any sort. We're talking about stock or mutual funds here, but particularly if someone wants to give a closely held business interest or they want to give a piece of real estate, then it becomes a little bit complex usually for the church to handle directly. So something like the National Christian Foundation can handle that for them. The assets go into the designated fund for the church. They're liquidated on the open market, and the proceeds then become available for the church to allocate to its missions programs or whatever designation it might have. I might also add, sometimes having that fund separate from the operating account of the church is an encouragement to people who want to designate their gift for that missions purpose. Sometimes, there's a hesitancy to do that if there's a commingling of operating and special missions fund assets.
And we coach ministries and churches that we work with to actually put the transfer instructions for marketable securities on their website. That way, if a donor has an account at Schwab and the church's account is with TD Ameritrade, the Schwab person can look right on the website and complete the transfer form, so it expedites the transfer of the marketable securities from one brokerage firm to another.
And all done electronically. Yeah, it's not hard to do. Very, very simple to do.
Yeah, and I know churches, large and small, that have started these ministry-advised funds, Virgil, through National Christian Foundation, and it's been a real benefit to them because they can not only cast this big vision, but then they can say, we can even receive those complex financial instruments, etc. So, yeah, I would encourage a church to look at that. A couple more questions here, gentlemen. This is from Joe Schwartzman. As stewards desiring to see the Great Commission in practice, how do we encourage our church to be more active in knowing where it's going? Some churches do not seem to follow through on benefactors' interest in giving to a specific mission. Is that not a part of stewardship and accountability?
Yes.
Yes. With vigorous head nods, I said.
Yeah, it's back to this knowing thing that we've already brought up a couple of times, and you mentioned Ralph Winter, Matthew. A lot of our problem is what we don't know. We don't know about the unengaged, unreached people groups of the world. I'm speaking of we, the church in general. We don't know that we can give appreciated assets and not have to pay capital gains tax. We don't know how to go about that process. So a lot of it is just the simple knowing, a little instruction, a little experiential knowledge goes a long way.
And Connie and I have really gotten significant benefit from actually visiting ministries and spending time with leadership and really seeing what they're doing, and in a couple of cases talking to the people who are the beneficiaries of that ministry that are actually their lives are being impacted by the work that's going on. It's been very helpful for us understanding how God is using the resources that we've been investing into that particular ministry.
Yeah. I think
just like we, the church, don't know about UUPGs, we don't know about the ministries that are out there attempting to reach those UUPGs. It's amazing what we, the church, don't know. And so that's where organizations like Matthew and, so many of 1615's partners are just so critical in terms of getting the word out.
Yeah, and I want to take that to the next level too. Not only the awareness of the opportunity and the need, but she talks here about the follow-through on the benefactor's interest. And I'm thinking of Acts 13 here, where the Holy Spirit said to the church leaders, set apart, Barnabas and Saul for the work which I've appointed them. They got sent out to the unreached, as it were. It was the first bona fide cross-cultural mission of the church. They took the gospel to the Gentiles. And then in Acts 14, it says they gathered the church together and they rehearsed all that God had done in the opening of the doors of faith to reach the nations. So there was feedback on impact or return on investment, however you want to describe that. So I don't know if that's helpful as well, that the stories of what God is doing, and you mentioned visiting the field, John, you can see firsthand what God is up to. I have another question here from Frank. This is a good one. They're all good so far, I should say. This is a really good one. Question regarding stewardship from a church's perspective. What advice might you have for a church board member who are not willing to invest any excess church funds in anything aside from cash/CDs?
This is an investment question, I think, now.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the story of the parable of the talents that Virgil started the day off with. And I don't know of a way to double money without taking risk. And two of those stewards clearly went out and traded. And it doesn't mean you take inappropriate risk, but there is, in my mind, a biblical acceptability risk. And Proverbs 11, verse 2 says, divide your portion among 7 or maybe 8, because you never know what calamity the world might bring. So there's instruction there on diversification. There's instruction on good investment process throughout the Scripture.
Wouldn't you say that's just like it is for an individual? The church is the same thing.
Same way.
Because they're wise investment principles like diversification, and like trying to maximize the rate of return to risk ratio in the context of a diversified investment portfolio. And so I don't think there's any difference there between how we should operate as a church or as individuals. We should be wise in doing that and and try to be as knowledgeable as possible. But, again, it can get back to the fear factor again. Fear of loss can sometimes intimidate us and prevent us from really investing as wisely as we might.
Yeah. Well, there are more questions, gentlemen, but we are running out of time. What I want to do with the remaining couple of minutes here is give you the opportunity, Virgil, John, to give some type of summary statement or just parting comment for our audience that is still online here, and then I'm going to talk about a few upcoming events and we'll wrap it up. So any parting comments from both of, or one of you? Why don't both of you share? That'd be great.
I feel like we've already given you more parting comments than anybody wanted to hear, but we would encourage our participants today to encourage the people that they work with. And if I had a bottom line, it would be think like a steward, as John says. Think like you're a manager, not an owner, and work like that. And consider gifting of appreciated assets. That would be my bottom line.
And I would say never write another check.
Well, let me jump in here too if I can. I'm thinking of Philippians 4 here, where Paul is encouraging the church to give. And he says, I am not asking for my own interest, but for your own. My own, not my own benefit, but for yours. And he says that it might be credited to your heavenly account. And it's an accounting term that speaks of the positive side of the ledger. And I think sometimes what's missing, this is my perspective at least, and you guys hit on it very clearly today, but what's missing in a lot of giving messages is the joy that comes from giving. You know, Paul clearly says, I'm asking you to give not for me, but for you. So giving is in our own best interest, not only here and now. There's great joy, as was mentioned throughout the webinar today, but also the heavenly inheritance, the joy of the worshiping souls and the worshiping nations that we were a part of bringing into heaven as we took God's assets and we just let them flow through our hands into these opportunities that were discussed. So I would just say, don't forget to talk about the joy that comes from Christ when we align ourselves with his plan of generosity and giving. So again,
Matthew,
yes, go ahead.
I might just encourage you to share your vision of Revelation 5. Compelling vision.
So we have this incredible picture in Revelation 5, and it's the great end to which all of history is moving. Nothing can stop it. It's unthwartable. It's unstoppable. And it's this picture of the fulfillment of the Great Commission. It's when the nations have all been discipled, as it were, and what we see is Jesus, the Lamb of God, slain from the foundations of the earth, and surrounding him is his reward. It's the worshiping representatives from every nation, every tribe, and every single tongue. And God invites us into that. History's greatest movement. We can take, again, the resources he's given us as stewards, invest them in his purposes. And if we've just been faithful to allow the gifts God has given us to flow through us, then I believe that the worshiping multitudes, the joy that they have will be a shared joy because we joined the Father in the family business. So is that what you were looking for, Virgil?
You got it. You nailed it.
All right. Well, again, Virgil and John, thank you so much. A lot of inspiration, but a lot of practical instruction and a lot of responses here from people that said thank you very much for what's been presented. I want to share this quote from Gail Irwin that I got years ago. He said, your stock portfolio in heaven is growing. Invest everything. So I thought that'd be a fitting comment here. Just a few more things here about upcoming events. We've had a great turnout that have stayed online here. So Reaching the Nations right here, right now will be led by Joan Lash of ISI. And then also we have an upcoming webinar, Mind the Gaps, which will be led by David Wilson of Avant Ministries on how churches can mobilize their own people to care for their missionaries. You can find out details and register online for those webinars at 1615.org. I'm going to leave these slides up here for just a moment so our audience can gather contact information. So we have Virgil, if you're interested in corresponding with him, or if you have more questions. John, and I'll leave it at that. A reminder, the webinar has been recorded, will be available shortly at 1615.org. To our live audience, thank you for participating. Thank you for your great questions. John and Virgil, thank you once more. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615, signing off.